Hello. So I'm upgrading this old Nikon D7000 to a Sony Alpha 7 III for a bunch of reasons I'll maybe talk about some other time, for why I picked that camera in particular. But I kind of wanted to make, a final video of sorts of this camera, talk a little bit about what I've enjoyed with it, what I've learned from it, and its shortcomings that have made me upgrade and things like that, as well as talk about my general Nikon gear, which has kept me company for since 2011 in some shape, way, or form. Okay, so first off, let's do the standard thing and just talk about the build. It's a good build. It's the standard Nikon, slightly smaller DSLR build that was maybe popularized by this camera. It's reasonably hefty and it almost feels heavier on this right side where the grip is and where the battery is as well. So you can actually feel the tug down like that. But that's okay, it's not a problem. You hold it properly, it works well. No real complaints. Reasonably heavy compared to modern mirrorless cameras, I suppose. You've got your dial here, you've got a dial here. Nice buttons. Well, I haven't tried too many cameras, but to me they're nice buttons. The LCD, which was good for the time, is probably pretty outdated now. I've still got the screen protector on here, so it's dirty, but that's just the protector, not the LCD below. What else? Oh yes, this thing, a feature that Nikon has neglected in many of their more modern cameras. This has two memory card slots, two SD card slots, which the D7000, the newest version of this line, does not. Heck, even the Z6 and I believe the Z7 don't either. That's a shortcoming on Nikon's part, a pretty big one, especially because I found at least that this particular card has failed on me a few times, and the JPEGs just start getting written to the first one, because I do NEF, so RAW in the first one and JPEGs in the second one. So if this fails, then they just start getting written here, and I should have replaced this second faulty card long ago, but it mostly works, so whatever. On this side, you've got the AV out, which I guess you can't see in the shadow there, is a pretty outdated port, even probably back then, but whatever, it was there. USB, no USB-C obviously in 2011. Micro HDMI. And at the bottom you've got a microphone jack. Yeah, it has a microphone jack even if the video sucks. And a GPS port. I wish they'd included the GPS in the camera. I wish more manufacturers included that within and you didn't have to rely on your phone or something else, which is silly to me. Bottom is just the battery and this strange port, which I think is only used for the grip. If you get like a third party or even the Nikon official grip, you'd put that in there, which I never did buy because I guess I just didn't want the extra weight. And there's the battery in here, standard Nikon battery. And on top you have this built-in flash. The flash itself has just occasionally been useful, but this has the Nikon's built-in creative control system or whatever it's called, which is extremely excellent. Maybe I'll give a demo of it later. So yeah, that's it for the build. The viewfinder is reasonably OVF. It's not an electronic viewfinder like the modern mirrorless cameras, but it's good. It's pretty bright. Hasn't really let me down ever. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the features, I guess. This had a 16 megapixel sensor, which for the time was pretty good. Nowadays most APS-C's crop cameras like this one are, I think, in the 20s, usually 24 or so, with some having like the Canon M6 Mark II has a 30 megapixel, which I think is the current biggest crop sensor megapixel rating. But yeah, 16 was pretty decent for the time. It's a little bit behind now. Most cell phones hit that limit now. But megapixels aren't everything per se, so that isn't the main reason I'm upgrading. It had a pretty advanced autofocus system for its time. It was a big deal because they brought in the autofocus. It was kind of brand new, I think. They brought it in they improved the one in their higher end DX body for this. And so people considered this camera at the time to be a very good enthusiast level camera. And then a lot of its features trickled down into the 5000 and 3000 series. Though it feels like, and maybe I'm just imagining it, but that Nikon let it down, and that future iterations of it didn't really have any significant improvements beyond, say, the tiltable LCD, which obviously this doesn't, and maybe a slightly better image sensor and stuff like that, I think. And here's like the autofocus flash gun, which helps the autofocus in certain conditions. Though I have had issues with its autofocus, but mostly in low light, and I'll try and talk about that in a bit. Now, this camera also has lots of features that I shamefully never really explored too well. I bought this guide at the time, and I don't think I ever read it cover to cover. I skimmed it a few times, and I was skimming it again just earlier today, and I I learned a few things I didn't actually know before. So that just tells you how much stuff, like for example, there's this info menu. Okay, I've seen this screen before. It's just talking about the settings and so on. But then you press info again, and then you can like customize your immediate settings. You can set the movie quality. You can set some ISO settings. Ignore that. That's just for the noise reduction. Oh, this is neat. I didn't actually know this was here. Distortion control for, like, I think it uses lens profiles to automatically fix images, as you would in Lightroom. You can set these picture controls to change what it looks like. You can change this. I've been changing these in post quite often, but I never really bothered to change it so conveniently from there. You can customize your buttons from here, the AEL button, as well as the button at the front, and this one, and so on. And I think you can probably customize this info menu too from the regular menu somewhere. Yeah, there are definitely some features I did not use. I never actually bothered to do any of the in-camera edits, for example, but that's not a big thing, not that useful. I didn't use too many of the metering modes, even though I did switch them, especially early on, but like later on you kind of realize it's almost too much worrying to think about, wide area metering, point metering. Forgot what that one's called, but it's another form of metering. So I generally just left that on the default. For most of my shooting career, so to speak, I just used the autofocus S mode with a single point, because I just did not like where the camera would jump it. And only recently I realized what C properly is, and it lets you track moving subjects pretty well, especially on this like Nikon Special 3D mode, which you can switch to like single point or wide area and wider area and so on. But I think what features I did use, I ended up making pretty good use of. I was generally using the aperture mode, because I prefer to edit the aperture instead of the shutter speed, and let the camera pick on the shutter speed. That has let me down in the past quite a bit, but that's mostly my own feeling, as well as some limitations of the camera. I didn't use the so CL is where you take more than one picture. There's a CL low, and then there's continuous high, so this takes more pictures with one shutter press, I mean. These are like the remote modes. I did have a remote, actually. I don't have it here on me for some reason, but I do have a wireless remote for it. you know, just mirror up and things like that, which are not that useful for me unless you're like trying to shoot silently or something weird and unusual. So yeah, good feature set for the time, especially. I think in some ways this camera had a lot more innovation in it compared to, you know, its predecessors in some ways. It almost feels like it was the last good Nikon DX camera. Maybe that was a 7200 instead. I never tried it, but well, okay, the D300 or 500 or whatever the higher end series is was obviously better, more expensive for pros and stuff. But for like folk who wanted something a bit more than just family portraits and weren't ready to like make money off of their photos, folk like me, this is was a pretty great camera at the time. So let's talk about my gear, what I bought over the years. It's not very impressive, but figure I might as well chronicle it. First lens I bought was this one that's on here. It's a 35mm f1.8 DX lens. Solid lens. It's been my friend for a long time. It's the first lens I got. It takes good photos. It is reasonably wide open at 1.8. To be fair, I didn't like it as much as like most people on the internet like it. It's generally the hurry up and go get it. This is your first lens, and I think it as a first lens it does work very well. But you know, that focal length of 52mm equivalent, I think roughly. It's not a bad focal length or anything like that. But I've compositionally not been too interested in the photos I've taken with it. But I think that also is a little bit dependent on where I've used it. I've taken, by this point in time, almost some 20,100 photos with this camera, so I've lost track of which lenses did best for me, kind of thing. My other prime is this 50mm 1.8D. So this is an older version of the 50mm. There's a newer one with a more plastic casing like this. I thought this older one looks better, and so I got it. It was also, I think, cheaper, and it has like a aperture ring built in here as well that you can, you know, change. And one of the coolest things about this lens is you can watch the aperture change in here. I mean, you can do this with a lot of lenses, but I just always like doing that, just like looking at it change. It's a satisfying build and satisfying lens to use. It's a very simple optic, right? There's barely anything in here. Focus is maybe a little bit slower than the other one, than the 35, for example, but it's more than adequate. It's a good lens. It works well. I don't think this was the second lens I got. I don't remember actually which order I got my lenses in, but yeah, it's my other prime. It's good. Quick edit, but I just wanted to like tweak in that after looking at my photos, I've only taken about 400 or so with this lens, and so I've done it a great disservice compared to my other stuff, and I really like some of them. I've barely taken any portraits with it because of, you know, slightly inconvenient focal length for indoor use, but some of the backgrounds are really nice, especially when you step it down to f2.8 or so. So yeah, definitely a lens every Nikon user should have, even if you're on full frame, because this is a full frame lens. It's not a crop sensor lens. So yeah, good lens. I wish I'd used it more, and if I keep using this camera, I'll try to use it more. This is the 18-55 kit lens. I did not get this with the camera. I got it much later when I thought, okay, maybe this focal length is useful. And I hate to admit that this was my most useful lens in terms of focal length and just general usability. It's at 18. It's, you know, 18-55. It's the ideal like carry around lens range, and I almost feel like a little bit of my disappointment comes because of this lens, because this was the lens I was almost coerced into using, because you know, when you're out with family anywhere, then you want that flexibility without having to change lenses, and its images are good sometimes, but it's also not very, it's 3.5 to 5.6 G. It's not very wide open. It doesn't look as good at those more open apertures. So yeah, if I could redo my 2010 experience, I think I would probably have invested in a brighter, higher quality glass, and that's actually part of my problem with the Nikon DX system as a whole, which maybe I'll talk about. But otherwise, very useful lens. Definitely, I recommend that you check it out, and because even if you don't use it very often, it's very good to just have around, because you will find use for that at some point. And it was only like $100 at the time, so not expensive either. Perhaps surprisingly, one of my better results as a lens goes is this other kind of kit lens. I don't know if this is technically a kit lens, the 55 to 300 mm, 4.5 to 5.6, and it's another DX lens. And I like this lens because of, well, I got it because of its reach. It's huge, right? 300 mm, it's 450 odd on this crop sensor camera, so it goes really far. And even just for taking photos of people, candid photos, I really like using this lens. I snipe them from across the room. They're making funny faces, or they're making cool faces, or they're making sad faces, and I get so many of them on film, well, on digital film, if you want to call it that, just by virtue of this reach. Just like zoom in quickly, take a photo. They're nice, and the background is nice and blurry because of that huge focal range. It's been good in that respect. It's been very useful. It's not very wide. It's not very high optically compared to like other Nikon lenses, of course, and things like that. But actually, to my surprise, I think out of all of my lenses, this one gives me the best colors. And I don't know why, but I've always been impressed by the colors on this lens. I don't think it's sharp. I'm sure my primes are sharper, but the color rendition on this lens has always has occasionally secretly surprised me. And I think especially if you stop it down just a little bit, it's probably a pretty good lens in that respect. Not super expensive. If you're just starting out, I think it's a good lens to get. Maybe the newer VR versions, if there is any. And this is just VR1. There is a newer version of this one, for example, the VR2, which I've heard is actually pretty good. Anyway, yeah, so yeah, back to this. Build quality is cheap, plastic, similar to this. Slightly better than this, I think, especially because the back is a metal mount compared to this one's plastic mount. But it's pretty heavy too, though, because, well, it's big telephoto, so it's kind of heavy. Much lighter than equivalent telephotos, I'm sure. But yeah, it's a good DX lens to have around because of how good your family pictures and portraits of friends and relatives and stuff end up looking. It just does a nice job at it, just by virtue of giving you all that reach for a relatively inexpensive price. So if you're starting off with a Nikon DX camera like the 3500 or the 5000 series, or maybe even the 7500, I do think this is a lens worth buying, unless you have more money and you can invest in one of the higher end telephoto lenses, but definitely worth having this reach at least. The only other lens I have left is this fisheye lens, which is more of a toy, pretty overpriced toy. Roughly 9-10 millimeters on crop sensor. This Tokinon Opteka 6.5 millimeter 3.5 aperture, completely manual focus fisheye lens. I've only really taken toy pictures with it, nothing good, but I mean it feels nice. At least it's completely metal. You'll notice that there's no contacts on here, so it's a completely manual lens, no EXIF data or anything like that. For my lenses, I got a few filters. Most of them had UV filters, but on a whim, once I bought a few others. I think I have like a few circular polarizers and some natural density filters and stuff in here. Nothing very fancy. I didn't really use them much at all. So, I mentioned earlier that this has this flash, and the most useful thing that Nikon did, bless their soul, or well, bless their money-making soul, I guess, is that they included a wireless flash system in this camera. And what that means is you don't have to rely on this. So you can buy external Nikon flashes. I have the SB700. This was one of the best decisions I've ever made, is buying this. My dad recommended I do it, and I'm so grateful to him because this flash has been a godsend whenever I've used it. So if you set it to remote, and now you turn it, put it down, you can trigger it like that wirelessly. So in that photo, it's a bit washed out here, but we had the flash going off on the side there, and that is wonderful. Of course, for the most part, I've just been when you're walking around, you just put it on top, and that's really been key to getting any kind of decent photos indoors for me. Do not trust anyone who tells you just to rely solely on aperture and ISO. So obviously you can't always use a flash. Don't use a flash in an art museum. But for any kind of indoor photo, get the flash, shove it in, bounce it up like that, and you are good. You don't have to buy the SB700. There are cheaper third-party alternatives for like $100, and they're probably still more than good enough. And just put this diffuser thing on that comes with the flash, and for the most part, your people or things even like these figures will look so much better. You'll have so many better colors, contrast, and everything else. Strongly recommended that you buy an external flash, even if your camera has a built-in one. So yeah, speaking of low light, so let's get to the reasons why I'm finally upgrading. So so it's been 9 years. You can give me some slack here. Sure, the camera still works. It's perfectly adequate. It takes decent photos when I want it to, or when I try to, or when I'm able to, if you want. But I like new shiny things, and that's the obvious reason. I just like spending money and wasting money. But there's a bit more to it than that, I guess. First off, so when this camera came out, people said it has great low light abilities, and I don't disbelieve them. I think they're correct, but if it struggles to focus in low light with autofocus, and you can use manual focus, but manual focus on a DSLR is iffy at best, just because you're relying solely on what you can see through here, and there's no magnification per se, unless maybe through live view there's a way. I don't think there is. The other reason is that so autofocus, okay, yeah, it's a little bit very wonky in the dark, especially at closer distances. Well, closer distances, that's lens dependent thing. But I've also found that like my pictures just look bad when I take them in any sort of questionable lighting conditions, and that's on me. Of course it's on me, but it feels like I was constantly hampered by the camera every time I try. If you go to ISO, reviews of this said ISO 1600 is perfectly usable, good. And yeah, I guess I've noticed grain at ISO 800 or above, which is okay depending on your circumstances. Grain can look nice too, but by grain I mean noise, digital noise. Um, but yeah, the other problem though is that if you try and limit your ISO to even say 800, the shutter speed drops pretty dramatically. You know, it's a crop sensor. It says an aperture of 1.8, but technically it's not exactly 1.8. I think some people say you have to multiply that by 1.52 as well. And so with that slower shutter speed, because I never bothered using a tripod, even though I have one over there, it gets blurry very fast, motion blur, because obviously my hands are not steady, and I can't use these VR lenses. I have to rely on my primes in any darker condition because obviously these don't have faster apertures. So I always felt very gooped by low light. There's no, I don't know, it just didn't feel right. And also, when you're using these prime lenses at even these decent quality primes, well, they're budget primes, at max, fully open apertures, their contrast and sharpness tends to drop as well. That's just, the law of lenses, unless it's a very expensive lens, and none of these are. So that didn't help. And of course, once you use a flash, your internal photos are much better, but you can't always use a flash, and sometimes I've forgotten. And in the past, I made this mistake of leaving auto ISO on. I mean, I always do leave it on, but the problem with it is that it's very, very aggressive with how it chooses to jump ahead. So it'll often, I've seen some photos which are like 1,000 plus ISO, but the shutter speed is still like 100 or 200, and it's just like I could have gone a bit slower, but you still jumped it up, unnecessarily to me. So you have to be careful. Make sure this 800 is what you want. In some cases you may even want 400, but I don't recommend taking it to 1600 because I think the camera will like to jump to that whenever possible. So yeah, it felt like it was lacking in low light for me. I'm sure more newer crop sensors, function a little bit better. And as a photographer, you're supposed to be more wary of light, add some of your own, and so on and so on. But so yeah, low light was one thing. Another thing, of course, I just like newer shiny stuff. And the other one, the reason why I can't just jump to the 7500 or some other Nikon DX body is that I felt limited by these lenses a little bit. Don't get me wrong, they're not, they've all made some good photos, and I'm sure they could make many more if I had been skillful enough. But you can't, it feels like you can get a better lens, but you'd have to usually jump to the FX version. And if you get an expensive DX lens, then it feels like a waste because, like, well, what if you want to upgrade your body and now your only way up is to an FX body? Now that DX lens is entirely useless. So those higher end crop sensor lenses are great for professionals who need DX bodies for like their sports photography or animal photography and so on. But for other people, it can feel limiting because you either buy an expensive lens and then you're kind of very much stuck in the DX system, or you get expensive FX lenses and they're kind of wasted on this DX body. So it's like kind of a situation. So I'm just throwing away the whole system. Well, okay, I'm not throwing anything away. This all will stay with me. I'm not even selling it, mostly because it's not worth much. And it'll be a good backup camera, or it'll be a good camera to give to a family member and so on, right? But yeah, poor thing is hopefully going to see much less use once my new camera comes in. And I do want to clarify that I love Nikon, or Nikon, depending on how you pronounce it. They're a great they're a great company, I hope. My dad's old Nikon film camera was what took all of our childhood photographs. I recently used that. It was still fun to use. And I've enjoyed and respected using this camera a lot. And I'll maybe talk about some other day why I didn't go into the Nikon mirrorless system, but that's for some other day. So yeah, there's my camera. You know, it's been a good friend, but I think, you know, there's been a lot of advancements in the electronics. My cell phone photos tend to look better these days, and I know with editing I can make these photos look much better, but you know, I of course, you know, shoot in RAW and do import into Lightroom and do edit a little bit, but there's just an element of, well, it's a lot of work sometimes to get a good looking photo out of it. Whereas, and it does feel like sometimes I'm limited by the focus, which was, of course, you know, it was great for the time, but you know, modern things like IAF may be nicer, and I want higher quality lenses that get me nice punchier colors. So yeah, that's the main reason I'm saying goodbye. Well, this video has been long, and hopefully I've been able to edit in some nice photos. Maybe I'll make some more sometime. Stick around. Take care.